There's a mental habit most people repeat every single day, and Edgar Cayce warned it quietly shapes the outcome of their lives. He called it the only synchronicity that mattered. Not numbers, not symbols, not dreams. Something far more immediate. Something happening right now, in the space between your thoughts and the world around you. Scientists are now seeing patterns in how repetitive mental states correlate with measurable shifts in decision-making, stress response, and even immune function. Patterns that align disturbingly well with what Cayce described nearly a century ago. Edgar Cayce gave over 14,000 readings in his lifetime. Most people remember him for past lives or health remedies, but buried in his transcripts is something else. A single mechanism he returned to again and again. He said that what you hold in your mind consistently doesn't just reflect reality, it participates in shaping the conditions you encounter, not metaphorically, structurally. He said the synchronicity wasn't between events, it was between expectation and experience. And he said most people never notice it because they're too busy reacting to what's already happened. If you want to understand how this works, stay with me, because what comes next changes how you see cause and effect. In 1929, Cayce gave a reading to a man who kept failing in business. The man asked if he was cursed. Cayce said no. He said the man carried a single thought pattern so rigid, so repetitive, that it functioned like a filter. Every opportunity that didn't match the filter was dismissed. Every setback that did match it was amplified. Cayce called it mental attunement. He said the man wasn't attracting failure. He was synchronizing with it. The reading suggested a shift in habitual thought. Not positive thinking, but a recalibration of what the man expected to see. Within 2 years, the man's circumstances had reversed. Not because the world changed, because his perceptual synchronicity did. This isn't about yuan-shi or manifesting, it's about something far more uncomfortable. Researchers in cognitive neuroscience have identified what they call attentional bias, the brain's tendency to prioritize information that confirms pre-existing expectations. It's not a flaw, it's a survival mechanism. But it creates a feedback loop. You expect danger, you scan for danger, you find danger, you expect more danger. The loop tightens. The synchronicity becomes self-reinforcing, and after a while you can't tell whether you're observing reality or constructing it. Cayce said this was the only synchronicity that truly mattered because it operated in real time. It didn't require belief. It didn't require ritual. It was always on. You couldn't opt out. You could only become aware of it, or let it run in the background, shaping your life without your consent. Here's where it gets strange. In the 1970s, a psychologist named Robert Rosenthal conducted an experiment. He told teachers that certain students in their class were intellectual bloomers, kids about to experience a surge in learning. The students were chosen at random. There was nothing special about them. But by the end of the year, those students had outperformed their peers. Not because they were smarter, because the teachers expected them to succeed, and that expectation changed how they interacted with those students. More eye contact, more patience, more encouragement. The students synchronized with the belief held about them. Rosenthal called it the Pygmalion effect. Cayce would have called it attunement in action. But then the contradiction appears. If expectation shapes experience, why do people with positive expectations still fail? Why do optimistic people get sick? Why do hopeful relationships collapse? This is where most explanations break down. And it's where Cayce went deeper. He said the issue wasn't the surface thought, it was the underlying vibration. You could think positive thoughts all day, but if beneath them was a hum of fear, doubt, or resistance, that's what synchronized. He said the subconscious mind was far more powerful than the conscious one, and the subconscious didn't care about your intentions. It cared about what you truly believed, what you repeated to yourself in the quiet moments, what you assumed without questioning. Modern psychology calls this implicit bias. The beliefs you hold without knowing you hold them. Studies show that people who consciously believe they're capable of success often carry subconscious associations between themselves and failure. Those associations don't show up in affirmations. They show up in behavior, in hesitation, in self-sabotage, in the tiny decisions that accumulate over time. The synchronicity Cayce described operates at that level, beneath awareness, in the place where you're not watching. And here's the next reversal. Even when people become aware of this pattern, they often can't change it, because awareness alone doesn't recalibrate attunement. Cayce said the shift required something more than knowledge. It required repetition, consistency, a sustained realignment of thought, emotion, and expectation over weeks or months. He said most people gave up too soon. They'd try for a few days, see no results, and conclude it didn't work. But the synchronicity was still forming, still tightening around the old pattern. It hadn't had time to dissolve. Neuroplasticity research supports this. The brain doesn't rewire instantly. It rewires through repeated activation of new neural pathways. If you spend 30 years expecting rejection, your brain has built a superhighway for that expectation. It takes sustained effort to carve a new path. And during that time, the old synchronicity is still in effect. You're living in the overlap. The old pattern is fading, but still functional. The new pattern is forming, but not yet dominant. That's the window where most people quit. Cayce gave a reading to a woman in 1933 who complained that nothing ever worked out for her. He told her to spend 10 minutes every morning picturing herself as someone things worked out for, not visualizing specific outcomes, just holding the identity of someone for whom life cooperated. She wrote back months later saying it felt like a waste of time. He told her to keep going. A year later, she wrote again. She said her circumstances hadn't dramatically changed, but her relationship to them had. She noticed opportunities she would have missed before. She responded to challenges differently. She stopped interpreting every setback as confirmation of her failure. The synchronicity had shifted, not because the universe rewarded her, because her attunement had recalibrated. But here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. If this is true, it means you've been participating in your own circumstances all along, not causing them, not attracting them in some magical sense, but synchronizing with them, tuning into certain frequencies of experience while filtering out others. It means that the patterns you see in your life aren't just happening to you, they're also happening through you, and that's a hard thing to accept, because it removes the comfort of being a passive victim. It introduces responsibility without guaranteeing control. Cayce was careful about this. He never said you could control outcomes. He said you could influence the field of probability. You could tilt the conditions in your favor. But the tilt was subtle. It didn't override free will, yours or anyone else's. It didn't bypass consequence. It didn't erase the past. It simply adjusted what you were likely to notice, likely to pursue, likely to encounter. And over time, that adjustment compounded. There's a concept in quantum mechanics called observer effect. The act of measuring a particle changes its behavior, not because the observer has magical powers, because observation is interaction. You can't observe without participating. Cayce said the same thing applied to life. You can't observe your circumstances without participating in them. Your attention isn't neutral. It's active. It's shaping what you see, which shapes how you respond, which shapes what happens next. The synchronicity isn't between you and the universe. It's between your inner state and your outer experience. And the boundary between the two is thinner than most people realize. In the 1940s, Cayce gave a reading to a man who asked why he kept attracting dishonest business partners. Cayce didn't blame the universe. He didn't suggest the man was cursed. He asked the man what he expected from people. The man said he expected to be cheated. He'd been cheated before, and he was always on guard. Cayce told him that expectation was a magnet, not because it summoned dishonest people, because it made him hypersensitive to any sign of dishonesty, real or imagined. It made him mistrustful. It made him project suspicion. And people respond to suspicion with defensiveness, secrecy, and withdrawal. The very behaviors the man feared. He wasn't attracting dishonest partners. He was synchronizing with a relational dynamic that confirmed his expectation. Cayce told him to expect integrity, to look for it, to assume it until proven otherwise. The man resisted. He said that was naive. Cayce said it wasn't about being naive. It was about breaking the loop. 6 months later, the man wrote back. He said he'd tried it. He'd made a conscious effort to approach people with an assumption of good faith, and something shifted. Not everyone became trustworthy, but the people who were trustworthy became more visible to him. He noticed them. He engaged with them. He built relationships with them. The dishonest ones were still out there, but they no longer dominated his field of experience. The synchronicity had changed. This is the mechanism Cayce kept returning to. It's not about denying reality. It's about recognizing that reality isn't fixed. It's probabilistic. At any given moment, there are multiple versions of what could happen next. Your attunement determines which version you're most likely to step into, not with certainty, but with momentum. And here's the final reversal. The people who resist this idea the most are often the ones most trapped by it, because resistance is itself a form of attunement. If you're constantly bracing for disappointment, constantly defending against failure, constantly expecting the worst, you're not protecting yourself. You're synchronizing with the very outcomes you fear. Cayce said the greatest danger wasn't negative thinking, it was unconscious thinking. The thoughts you repeat without noticing, the expectations you carry without examining. Those are the ones that shape your life, because they run in the background, unchallenged, day after day, year after year. Cognitive behavioral therapy is built on this principle. It's not about replacing negative thoughts with positive ones. It's about becoming aware of automatic thoughts, the ones that fire without your permission, and questioning them. Are they true? Are they helpful? Are they based on evidence or assumption? Most of the time, they're based on repetition. You've thought them so many times they feel like facts. But they're not facts. They're patterns, and patterns can be interrupted. Cayce said the first step was noticing, not judging, not fixing, just noticing. What do you expect when you wake up? What do you assume about your day before it starts? What do you tell yourself when something goes wrong? Those are the synchronicities forming. Those are the attunements tightening. And if you don't notice them, they become your default reality. The second step was repetition. He said you couldn't think your way into a new pattern. You had to live your way into it. You had to practice the new expectation even when it felt false, even when the old pattern was still delivering results. Because the lag time between shift and evidence could be weeks or months. And most people quit during the lag. They say it's not working. But the synchronicity is forming beneath the surface, in the decisions they're making differently, in the opportunities they're noticing, in the way they're showing up. The evidence comes later, the attunement comes first. There's a study from 2011 where researchers tracked people's daily expectations and daily outcomes over 6 months. They found that people who expected positive interactions were more likely to initiate them. They smiled more, they made eye contact, they asked questions, and as a result, they experienced more positive interactions. Not because the universe rewarded them, because they created the conditions for it. The synchronicity was behavioral, it was relational, it was real. But the study also found something else. People who expected negative interactions avoided them. They made less eye contact, they kept conversations short, they stayed guarded, and as a result, they experienced fewer positive interactions. Not because positive people didn't exist, but because they never engaged long enough to find out. The synchronicity was avoidance, and avoidance confirmed the expectation. The loop closed. Cayce said this was the trap. The pattern protects itself. It gives you just enough evidence to keep believing in it. You expect betrayal, you guard against it, people sense your guardedness and pull back, and you interpret their distance as proof they can't be trusted. You expect failure, you hesitate. The hesitation costs you the opportunity, and you interpret the loss as proof you were right to hesitate. The synchronicity becomes self-sealing, and the only way out is to interrupt it before it confirms itself. He gave a reading in 1936 to a woman who said she felt trapped in a cycle of bad luck. Cayce told her there was no such thing as luck. There was only attunement. He told her to spend 5 minutes every evening reviewing her day, not to judge it, but to notice what she'd expected and what had happened. He said most people never made that connection. They experienced their day as a series of random events. But if she looked closely, she'd see the thread, the expectation preceding the experience, the assumption shaping the interaction. He told her to do this for 30 days without trying to change anything. Just observe. She wrote back after 30 days. She said it was disturbing. She said she saw the pattern everywhere, how she expected her boss to criticize her and then interpreted neutral feedback as criticism, how she expected her husband to be distant and then withdrew first, which made him distant in response, how she expected conversations to go badly and then braced herself in a way that made them go badly. She said she felt complicit in her own misery. Cayce told her that was the breakthrough. Not the misery, the awareness of complicity. Because complicity meant capacity. If she'd been shaping it unconsciously, she could shape it consciously. But that's where the real work began. Because conscious shaping isn't about forcing positivity. It's about loosening the grip of the old pattern. It's about creating space for something else to emerge. Cayce said the mind was like a garden. You couldn't just plant new seeds. You had to pull the weeds. And the weeds were the automatic thoughts, the reflexive expectations, the inherited beliefs, the ones you didn't choose but adopted anyway. Modern neuroscience confirms that the brain is biased toward negativity. It's called the negativity bias. We notice threats more quickly than opportunities. We remember pain more vividly than pleasure. We give more weight to criticism than praise. It's not a character flaw, it's an evolutionary advantage. In a dangerous environment, the cost of missing a threat is death. The cost of missing an opportunity is just a missed opportunity. So the brain errs on the side of caution. It scans for danger. It expects problems. It synchronizes with survival. But we no longer live in that environment. The threats are different. The dangers are abstract. And the negativity bias, once adaptive, now distorts. It makes us see danger where there's only uncertainty. It makes us expect betrayal where there's only distance. It makes us interpret neutral events as negative ones. And the synchronicity follows. We tune into a frequency of threat, and threat is what we find. Not because it's all that's there, because it's all we're looking for. Cayce said the antidote wasn't denial. It wasn't pretending threats didn't exist. It was expanding the range. It was making space for the neutral, for the uncertain, for the possibility that things might go differently than they have before. He said most people lived in a binary, good or bad, safe or dangerous, success or failure. But life operated in gradients, and the synchronicity was most powerful in the middle space, in the uncertain space, in the space where expectation hadn't yet hardened into outcome. That's where choice lived. In the gap between stimulus and response, in the moment before the automatic thought fired, in the breath before the old pattern took over. Cayce said if you could catch yourself in that gap, even once a day, you could begin to interrupt the synchronicity. You could pause. You could ask, is this true or is this habit? Is this happening or is this what I expect to happen? And here's the strangest part. The more you interrupt the pattern, the weaker it gets. Not because you're fighting it, because you're no longer feeding it. Patterns require repetition. They require unconscious agreement. The moment you notice them, they lose some of their power. Not all of it, but some. And that's enough to create a crack. A small opening. A chance for something else to enter. Cayce gave a reading to a man in 1938 who'd been unemployed for 2 years. The man said he'd applied to hundreds of jobs and heard nothing back. Cayce asked him what he expected when he applied. The man said he expected rejection. Cayce asked him how he could tell. The man said because he'd been rejected so many times. Cayce asked him what he did after he applied. The man said he waited. He checked his mail. He refreshed his email. He replayed the interview in his mind, picking apart everything he'd said wrong. Cayce told him that was the synchronicity. The waiting wasn't neutral, it was charged with expectation, and the expectation was shaping how he showed up in the interviews, how he answered questions, how he held himself. The employers weren't rejecting him, they were responding to what he was projecting. Cayce told him to apply with a different expectation, not confidence, not certainty, just openness. He told him to picture himself as someone employers wanted to hire, not because he was special, because he was solid, reliable, present. He told him to hold that identity while he applied, and then to let it go, to stop checking, to stop replaying, to move on to the next one without attachment. The man said that felt impossible. Cayce said it would feel impossible until it didn't. 3 months later, the man got hired. He wrote to Cayce and said he didn't know if it was the technique or just timing. Cayce wrote back and said it was both. Timing is never just timing. It's the convergence of readiness and opportunity. And readiness isn't about skill. It's about attunement. The man had been skilled the whole time, but he hadn't been attuned. He'd been synchronized with rejection. And once that shifted, the field shifted with it. This is what makes the concept so uncomfortable. It suggests that much of what we experience isn't random, it's resonant. We're not passive receivers of reality, we're active participants, and the participation happens whether we're aware of it or not. The only question is whether we're participating consciously or unconsciously, whether we're shaping the synchronicity or being shaped by it. Cayce said most people never asked that question. They just lived. They reacted, they repeated, and the synchronicity formed around them like a shell, invisible, unquestioned, determining the boundaries of what they experienced, what they noticed, what they believed was possible. He said the only way to break the shell was to see it, not to fight it, not to wish it away, but to see it clearly, to name it, to recognize it as a pattern, not a truth, and then, slowly, patiently, to practice a different pattern, not because it would guarantee a different outcome, but because it would create a different synchronicity, a different field of probability, a different range of what could happen next. And maybe that's the real message, that we're always synchronizing with something. The question isn't whether, it's what. And the answer isn't out there, it's in here, in the space between thought and experience, in the habit you repeat without noticing, in the expectation you carry like a second skin.